Welcome to the Barents Observer, and this podcast where we bring up pressing issues and look behind the headlines. My name is Atle Staalesen, and the topic of today's podcast is Kirkenes, the small town in northern Norway, located near the border to Russia, and the cross-border cooperation that has been in this region over a long time. Our guest in the studio today is Bjarge Fors, leader of the Barents Institute, a local research institution and a part of the UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. Welcome, Bjarge. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Kirkenes has, over 3 decades, tried to build a position as a gateway, as a bridge between East and West, and as a kind of a laboratory for cross-border relations and a hub for Barents cooperation. Why did this fail?
Well, a bridge between East and West, laboratory for cross-border people-to-people cooperation, hub for Barents cooperation. There are many of these words and terms, and I think first I should point out that there is a certain mismatch between brand and reality here. Norwegian actors, from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to local authorities to the Barents Secretariat, have for years been actively conveying this idea of Kirkenes as something extraordinary, something a very important place with the mission of sort of being a mediator between East and West. Great transnational center with an even greater future. Yes, Kirkenes was to some extent a local center for regional cross-border cooperation and cross-border relations, but the magnitude of this and the importance of this were always slightly exaggerated, I would say. And perhaps this exaggeration today makes the failure appear even worse than it really is, because it was never that good. But anyhow, there was a failure, I agree with you, and the failure of the Barents cooperation at large is of course very much related to the fact that meaningful cooperation with Russia in the end proved to be impossible. And this had to do with the authoritarian turn taking place in the country, with the crumbling of civil society. People-to-people cooperation becomes rather meaningless if the people has no real saying or freedom to act.
Can you call it a kind of an experiment? And to what extent was it an artificial experiment? And can you say that this kind of cooperation was viable?
If we think of the last decade of cooperation, I think it shows quite clearly that it was not viable. But then we are speaking about the last decade. If we look further back to the early 90s, I think 3 decades ago, when all this started, things looked very, very different, and I believe at that time one could not imagine how this would develop and how it would end. So at that time it was certain there were certainly possibilities, also positive possibilities.
So there has been a change over many years. You started off in the 1990s, and you had a kind of a collapse within the last few years, a gradual collapse, I would say. But what can be learned from this, and did anything good come out of it after all?
Well, of course, there are many lessons to be learned here. Of course, there are bad lessons. What not to do, what we cannot expect to succeed. We cannot expect to succeed when we go into cross-border cooperation with an authoritarian state on the other side. But on the other hand, a lot of good things came out of it. I mean, especially during the early phases of the cooperation, I think this really provided people on both sides of the border with a great opportunity for meeting with the other side, from learning from the other side, and that was really important after the Cold War, when the border had been more or less closed for many years. The value of this should not be underestimated, even today, I think. And I think it marked a generation, and at least the people who were involved locally on both sides in the 90s.
Your institute, the Barents Institute, has over many years worked with these cross-border relations and with research colleagues from both from Russia and from the Nordic side. How can you do this kind of work today when the border is more or less closed? Can you still have a cross-border research focus?
Well, our task is mainly to study borders. We may also study closed borders, and the Norwegian-Russian border was fairly closed also before 2022. We shouldn't forget about that. It was a really hard border. It never opened for real after the Cold War. So the change is not that radical. Of course, there is no cooperation nowadays with Russian partners. Unfortunately, it's not possible anymore. On the other hand, we have strengthened our cooperation with Finnish partners, and that gives us a lot. So that's important for us now.
I know I know the Barents Institute has worked also actively with cultural cooperation, and this has also been one of many priorities of this cooperation, and it's been very solidly supported also from the Norwegian government. What can you say about the cultural cooperation that developed here over the years?
Well, first, cultural cooperation has been it's been a very rich field and an important pillar of the Barents cooperation, and I believe that some of the reason for this is that one actually failed to establish real cooperation in harder, so to speak, fields like business or infrastructure, things like that. So then it was culture, sport. It was possible, and it was an interest for it. In Kirkenes, for instance, it's been a flourishing cultural life, very much related to cooperation with Russia over the years. What has marked this cooperation? I would say that it's been like a sort of a top-down state involvement in culture here that has coexisted with cultural initiatives from below. Very interesting mix, this top-down, bottom-up. Sometimes we've seen that Barents artistic projects have been instrumentalized for foreign policy aims, serving either as entertainment or as let's say propaganda for the Barents project or for Norwegian-Russian friendship. And these projects that often have been praised for their positive message, so to speak, have of course been perhaps less interesting from an artistic point of view. And I think they have also meant less for those involved. But on the other hand, you have had these projects that have emerged more independently from below, and that's project where art has been created without being instrumentalized by macro political actors. And this form of cooperation has been more interesting and also, I think, rewarding for those involved on both sides, and both for artists and audience. Because it has involved a real, meaningful exchange.
So you had cooperation from below and you had it from above,
Yes.
and that's perhaps something you can say about other parts of the so-called Barents cooperation as well. To what extent is this cooperation in this region to what extent was it unique if you compare to other border regions in Europe?
Well, I believe that usually one points at the fact that the regions were involved to a larger extent, that it was a sort of bottom-up participation. We shouldn't exaggerate this uniqueness either, but there was this special structure where you also involved the regional level. So it was never purely top-down, but it was never purely bottom-up either. There was a very strong involvement from the national government on both sides, and without this involvement, it would probably have been impossible from the start.
Some years back, Kirkenes tried to build a so-called twin city cooperation with the neighboring Russian towns. What was the essence of this idea?
Yeah, what was the essence of it? Well, to start with, this was now we are back in 2008. So this is, and we are speaking about Kirkenes and the Russian town of Nikel, which is a part of Pechensky Rayon, Pechenga district. The process started actually when the foreign minister at the time, Jonas Gahr Støre, wrote a letter to the mayor of Sør-Varanger, Linda Beate Randal at the time, urging her to establish or to work towards a twin city agreement between Sør-Varanger and between Kirkenes and Nikel. And he also assured her that the Russians were in, that his colleague Sergei Lavrov had been informed and supported the project. So they worked on it, and 3 months later the agreement was ready-made and signed during the festive dinner of the foreign ministers meeting in Kirkenes. That was the declaration. Well, you asked about the essence of this, and that's interesting because there wasn't much of an essence, really. If you looked at the content of this agreement, it was very much similar to the old friendship agreement between Sør-Varanger and Pechenga from 1973. Nothing much new added, really. This was sort of a failure, as have some scholars they pointed at who have been looking at it, because it lacked substance. In my own doctoral thesis, I actually argue that this agreement had some meaning, but that the real intention of it never was to actually ensure integration. It was to give an impression of integration. So I think of this as a sort of a political performance. I think we should think of it in retrospective as more symbolic politics than substantial politics. And in that, in this sense, it was actually quite successful, because it created some optimism. It gave people an idea that something was happening, and it also strengthened the desired image of Kirkenes as a transnational center, and where a lot of things were happening. So in that sense, it was a success, I think.
Kirkenes and the municipality of Sør-Varanger also had friendship agreements with Pechenga. and also quite remarkably with Severomorsk, which is the headquarters city of the Northern Fleet. What happened to these agreements?
Well, they have been abandoned, both of them, haven't they? After a lot of debate, and this debate began after the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine. It went on for a long time. The municipal council was split in half, more or less. Council members wanted to terminate these agreements, half of them not. And then there were separate discussions about the Severomorsk agreement and the Pechenga agreement, and so on and so forth. It was a long story, and in the end, there was just a very narrow majority for terminating them, right?
So there are many people, local organizations and local inhabitants in Kirkenes that have invested quite much time and efforts and also money actually in this cooperation. Do they have a reason to be not only disappointed but also bitter about what has happened?
Yes, I would say that there are people in Kirkenes who have devoted much of their life to this experiment, as you call it, and for whom Barents has been an important part of their identity. And of course they have believed in this, and of course it's disappointing for these people to see their dream crushed, and to experience that their efforts, that the efforts that they have put into this have been in vain, and also to experience probably now that what they achieved or did does not have a value today when we see how it all ended. So some people may also rightfully feel that they have been fooled, I think, not only by the Russians but also by Norwegian national local authorities who kept on encouraging these efforts even after it became quite clear that it was futile.
So Kirkenes tried to build a so-called Barents identity, and is there today attempts to re-identify locally? How is Kirkenes trying to build a future without Russia and without the Barents Cooperation?
Well, first, Kirkenes was the only place where a Barents identity emerged, I would say. Not a regional transnational Barents identity, but Barents identity as a local identity, because Barents provided Kirkenes with greatness and importance. It gave it a mission, as we have been speaking about. So it became something celebrated, of course. Kirkenes promoted itself as the Barents Capital, and just look at the number of names in this town with something with Barents in, starting with your Barents Observer and my own Barents Institute, and then there is the Barents Safari, Barents Bus, Barents Swimming Pool, and so on and so on. It became a very positive word, brand word. Today Barents is dead, and for sure this town will have to reinvent itself. And this reinvention, it's going on right now. What will come out of it, we don't know, and I don't think we will know until some time. Many things can happen. We could see a revival of the old mining town identity, especially if the mine reopens again. We could, Kirkenes could also become a sort of a proud garrison town. If the military here is further strengthened, you could have this kind of frontier mentality emerging. What is certain is that the identity will relate less to cross-border relations with Russia and less to Russia. I'm quite sure about that.
So what do you think then? Are to what extent are people in this town divided or disunited or polarized in with regards to this past, to the cooperation, and also with regard to today's relationship to Russia?
Yeah, I think people have different opinions, but the polarization has, I believe, been sort of over communicated and exaggerated by outsiders, mainly, probably by Russian actors, but also by Norwegian, Western reporters, journalists visiting this place who wants to make some dramatic story out of this. It is certainly a myth that people here are more pro-Russian than elsewhere. We recently had a report actually from Niebuhr busting this myth, right? The exception would probably be elements within the small Russian minority, but then again within this minority we find everything from ardent supporters of the regime to very vocal anti-regime exiles. I think the main division within this society is not between pro-Kremlin and anti-Kremlin. It's between those who would like to mark a definite end to the local investment in Barents and Norwegian-Russian friendship, and those who will not. We have seen this division with regards to several debates. You mentioned the debate about the friendship agreements. That's one example. Then there's been the debate about this Russian Cyrillic street signs, and then there has been the debate about restrictions for the movement of Russian sailors visiting Kirkenes. In all these debates, we've seen these two groups fighting each other. The political right generally supports a tough stance, whereas the left, and I would say especially the Labour Party, argues against it. But again, this does not mean that the local Labour Party here is pro-Kremlin, not at all. I believe it makes little sense to think about it that way. I think this is about sort of an expression of ownership to and nostalgia for the old Barents identity of the town. And the left is, I believe, more strongly attached to this old identity than the right.
You mentioned the street signs in Kirkenes. Some of them are written in the Cyrillic language in Russian. And shortly after Russia launched its full-scale war on Ukraine in 2022, you wrote a column in Norwegian newspapers where you called for a debate about whether or not to keep these street signs. Can you say what you think? Should they be removed?
Yeah, there was actually even before I wrote this column, there was an upheated debate about this signs, and there was a petition at the time, petition campaign to remove that, which eventually failed. At the time, I did not argue that the signs should be removed, but I tried to bring in some facts, aspects that I thought was important for the politicians who eventually should make a decision about whether to keep these signs or not. And that was, if you ask me, an important decision to make. So I wanted to give them some suggestions, some facts. And one important fact was that these signs had actually initially been raised for commercial reasons as a way of branding the town. It has not been an effort to represent a minority in public space. You couldn't compare it to, let's say, the Sami road signs in Sør-Varanger. It's a completely different stories. And the Russians in Kirkenes were never involved in setting up these signs, nor did they intervene to keep them in 2022. So it was mainly the Norwegians there who defended the signs eventually. The majority, the vast majority probably of the population here would like to keep the signs. But I at the time urged the politicians to consider whether the signs really represented the desired identity of Kirkenes in a post-Barents time. Would they fit into a new reinvented Kirkenes? And my advice was, if yes, keep them, if not, remove them. And I also recommended them to consider whether these signs and other public symbols of Russianness in Kirkenes could be exploited in order to challenge Norwegian territorial sovereignty. At the times they were set up, the local chief of police actually expressed concerns that they could weaken national sovereignty in the borderland, and he claimed that we should mark that we are in Norway. At the time, no one listened to him. As far as I know, it was the only person who raised some criticism at the time when they were set up. If you ask me, I would not have raised these signs today, but this is not for me to decide.
Kirkenes, this small town was a site for very bloody fighting during the Second World War. And today there is a major Soviet-style war memorial here in the center of the town. Can you say what's the symbolic force of this monument today?
Yeah, this is really a question for my good colleagues at UiT, Joachim Olmen Markussen and Kari Aga Myklebust, who have been writing extensively about this. I've been writing a little bit about it. What I can say is that this monument has played a key role in Norwegian-Russian relations since it was raised in 1952. Since the end of the Cold War, even more so. It's been even more important. It's been the arena for Norwegian-Russian meetings, and it's been like a symbol for Norwegian-Russian brotherhood. And it has also worked as a concrete manifestation of local gratitude to the Red Army. I think we should add that as well. It is my impression that there is an increasing understanding now in the borderland for how Russia and also Norway engages in memory politics, thanks to the informative work of scholars like the ones I mentioned, but also journalists and increasingly also politicians. Still, there doesn't seem to be much support for removing this monument. Like we've seen other places in Europe, in the Baltics, for example. Here I think it's rather a support for reclaiming the monument, and that's another thing. That's about using this monument for telling our stories about the wars of past and present. So, and here the current mayor, for instance, has played an active role. Also, on more than one occasion, the monument has been the site for local protests against the Russian regime and its narratives. So in this way, the monument may actually serve as a site for memory political deterrence as well, actually.
Bjarge Fors, leader of the Barents Institute, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Keep on reading stories from the Barents Observer. Listen to our podcasts. Stay tuned.